Hey, internet user, I'm Rob Booker. Do you have a phone? Because if you have a phone and it's an Android phone, you can get the Traders Podcast app on your Android device by typing in Traders Podcast, no spaces between the words, and that will pull up the new Traders Podcast app for Android devices. If you're on an iPhone or an iPad, the app is coming soon to you as well. You can download it today in the Google Play Store. Now on to the podcast.
Hello, Rob.
Hello, Mr. Piles.
How are you today?
I'm good. I have a question for you.
Okay, I'm ready.
So you're standing in Germany, and it's 1942, and
Okay.
you're in the war room with Hitler, and he's starting a podcast.
Whoa.
So like old school, like iTunes from 1942.
Okay.
Because like we know that Shield and the Avengers had certain they had like TiVo back then. If you watch the new Captain America movie, anyway, so Hitler wants to start a podcast, and you have this microphone cord, and you can. He turns around and you can wrap that microphone cord around his neck. Do you do it?
Oh, boy. You know, having the knowledge that I know now about Hitler, because
Yeah.
a lot of the stuff about him came out after 1942, right? But yeah, I mean, knowing what I know now, if I knew that knowledge, then maybe I could do that. Maybe I could take him out. Or the other thing I could do is just, if he wanted me to produce a podcast for him, I could just persuade him to tie his message in with one of my hobby podcasts, and nobody would listen to it. So
Then he would fall off into irrelevance.
and obscurity, yes, that would work just as well.
I killed Hitler by putting him on my podcast.
Exactly. That's what I do.
Okay, Hitler was a despicable human being, of course, and
Yes.
we're laughing about him now, but he was never laughable, of course. I wondered. So you avoided the question, which is typical diplomatic. You know, you're like, I don't want to choose sides in World War II or anything.
No. I like I said, I would take him out. Like if I knew what I knew, I would do it. But killing, I'm not much of a killer.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, I'm
think.
not either. That's why I asked, actually. What if the entire world was watching? Not because they were expecting you to kill him. What if you just happened to be broadcasting on direct TV that night in 1942?
Oh, okay. Would I be aware that the entire world was watching?
Yeah, like you were like international reporter.
Okay. In that case, maybe I would. This is ridiculous. I would try to apprehend him with
Okay.
the cord that you're speaking of. Maybe
Okay.
tie him up in front of the world.
Okay.
So how about that?
Yeah, that's acceptable. Maybe kill him and then act like when you got there he was already dead.
Yeah, exactly. There you
Can't
go.
interview this guy.
He wanted to be an artist. He was depressed about not making it. You know. that kind
Yeah,
of thing.
I wonder about that. It certainly wasn't laughable back in the day. I would probably kill him. I would probably kill him, even if it meant that I would die. I think I would enjoy killing him. It's probably a bad thing to say.
Yeah.
I'm
Like
super
about-
pacifist, though, and the reason I ask this is because there is just all kinds of death and carnage going on. Have you been following any of this news? It's just awful.
Yeah, I have been a little bit. Like for example, that plane getting shot down just shocked me to no end.
Yeah.
I was.
I as a frequent flyer, I got to tell you, when we're up in the plane, the last thing we're thinking about is choosing sides in the Ukraine. But I got to tell you, this certainly helps me choose a side.
Yeah.
My gosh, why don't people calm down? And I wonder sometimes. I wonder about it. Like, so all these people, and this is the point I'm getting to, Jason, is all these people have the choice to kill someone. And we talked about Hitler, and it seems like a reasonably easy decision to make when we're talking about pretty much one of the greatest tyrants of the 20th century.
Yes.
Seems pretty easy. But then if you talk to either side in the Ukraine, they think it's pretty justifiable to kill one another. In fact, the justification of the Ukrainian rebels or whatever, listen, I'm not choosing a side, but they're all they're all disgusting. They're all killing each other. I mean, it's disgusting. And then you go to Gaza and this mutual hatred that they have for each other. They're posting videos on YouTube with the Israelis trade satirical videos. One intersperses an Arab political speech with a slobbering goat. You know, listen, I think we've come to the point in world history where the people who kill each other and then make fun of each other for it, like they have been relegated to irrelevancy. They died off. It's just, it's disgusting. And then another replaces the heads of Palestinian fighters with Angry Birds characters. You know, listen, I understand that you have differences with each other in a certain part of the world, but this is disgusting. And then, of course, and Hamas and are circulating remarkably similar video clips of exploding buildings with thundering soundtracks that evoke Hollywood thrillers. When children are dying, I don't think it's a Hollywood thriller. And I think, Jason, there's a trading aspect to this, and I want to make it clear before we get into that all of this is just despicable. I find it abhorrent. And the fact that they make videos about it or they joke about it or they think it's funny or whatever, I think that if you have an opinion that part of the world is important to you and that it's important enough to you that it's worth killing children, then you need to remember that somebody's probably feeling like it's worth killing your children. And at some point in time, we have to stop killing each other's children. Like, that's a really, really, really bad thing to do. Even if you believe that your supernatural heavenly being consecrated that earth with special powers, it's still not justifiable. Like we all have to. This has to stop at some point. So anyway, that's the side that we take on the podcast. Is that I hope there can be a brokered arrangement where people can wrap their head around the idea that getting along is not so hard. It's like it is, even if you have long-standing horrible feeling towards one another, and I'm not supposed to understand that. I just think when you start killing children, there isn't a justification that you can propose over thousands of years of hatred. And this is probably not a suitable conversation for the podcast, Jason. And it makes me wonder at what point is killing justifiable as a retribution or as a prevention, as a preventative measure. It brings to mind the excellent book by Thomas Friedman, which was probably the last interesting thing the guy wrote, which is called From Beirut to Jerusalem. And it chronicles, it won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, and it chronicles his time as a correspondent for the New York Times in Beirut and Jerusalem, and how deeply difficult that conflict is. And in a world where we do a podcast about making money, which is very superficial, it's important to remember that there is enormous suffering going on in the world, and there are people who believe that their sides are so justifiably defensible that they can kill each other's children. And when we live in that kind of a world, all of the other stuff that we talk about on this podcast is sort of massively irrelevant. And with that, I want to launch into how to make money from the conflict, which is the other thing we do here, which is it's the other side of the coin. Is how do you protect yourself financially in a situation like this? Jason, do you think it probably has occurred to our listeners that this conflict could spill over into the markets?
Oh yeah, and I mean, isn't it already, Rob? Are you seeing that a little bit?
Surprisingly, not as much as we would ordinarily have seen. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about after ruining our relationship with thousands of our podcast listeners is I wanted to talk about the fact that the flight to safety, or the expulsion of risk from one's portfolio has generally and historically been caused by political conflict, not even necessarily conflict like death conflict, but political conflict. The stalling of elections or an election outcome that is murky. Those are always terrible for currencies, really bad for currencies.
Yeah.
But even more so lately, the flight to safety has a lot to do with the stability of the financial sector. And what you're seeing right now is the Dow Jones Industrial Average or the S&P 500 making these spectacular highs in the midst of some pretty terrible news coming out of the Middle East and conflict with Russia. And it's because the financial markets remain relatively stable. You have the financial markets in Dubai crashed, but that has more to do with the fact that whole thing was overbought and there's a real estate bubble in Dubai. And you can see the euro yen or the Australian dollar Japanese yen or some of the yen currency pairs dipping or falling backward off their highs. Mm-hmm. But that then once again, that has a lot to do with the fact that those are natural corrections within a larger upward trend. And you still see the British pound making these spectacular highs, and the British are generally known to begin the process of raising interest rates more quickly than other countries. And so you're seeing an appreciation in the British pound because the financial markets are strong. And I want to just say that for the record, the financial markets have remained durable and robust in the midst of all of this. But I think that we are ready for a bit of a correction. And here are some of the signs that you would see that would point the way to that. If you see the Dow Jones Industrial Average drop below and stay below 17,000 for a couple of days, I think that's important. If you see the euro/Japanese yen fall below 137, and if you're listening to the podcast and you're not a currency trader, you can find that quote pretty much freely available on Google if you just type in euro yen quote. Look for that to drop below 137 and stay below 137 for longer than a day or two. That's a pretty significant drop. And the euro yen is a proxy for the financial markets. You can look at the euro yen and you can say, well, that sums up what we think about the financial markets right now. And as goes the euro yen, so go the financial markets. That's really true also for the Australian dollar, Japanese yen as well. And what you're seeing is these financial instruments struggling at those levels. If you see those things happen, and you might even anticipate it, if you're listening to the podcast on Monday, July 21st, you might even anticipate it if you are a currency trader by buying the Swiss franc. Dollar Swiss franc would be a sell trade. If you sell the dollar Swiss franc, you are selling dollars and buying Swiss francs. There's always two sides to every transaction. If you look at the British pound Swiss franc, it has been on an increasingly savage upward trend, but is ready for a rest. And it seems to be coming to this point of rest at the same time of this conflict around the world. So you might look at selling the British pound/Swiss franc. That is exactly what I did last week and have continued to do this week. And that's trading in the range of 53.25 and 53.49 is where I sold it. And I'm thinking that that's going to go down to 52.50, which is not a significant decline, but could go as low as 51.50 and even as low as 1.5 thousand, which would be a more significant correction in the midst of a larger upward trend. But I think we're ready for that. I think we're seeing the signs of that happening. And for members of the Trifecta course, which I sold a few months back, they are pretty familiar with the signs of these reversals happening. And we're getting all of these signs simultaneously across the board on a wide variety of financial instruments. If you're long the general indexes, now would be a good time to go to the side and get into cash. And if you miss another run up in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, if you're a trader, you naturally get in and out of stuff already anyway, and you would be familiar with and comfortable with that kind of situation. And if the Dow Jones Industrial Average can fall back into the 16,000s, you might go back into things like the S&P 500 and whatever else. But Jason, I think that we've reached a point where I don't want to call a top in the market. That's not what we do here. But I want to say we're ready for a correction, and the conditions are ripe for that, and the sign that all the warning signs are flashing for this. And of course, I could be wrong, and I would be happy to be wrong about that. But it does appear that we're coming into a period of time like that.
So, what's the best? And maybe you just because some of what you said, of course, is a little over my head. But what's the best thing that the listeners can do to prepare for that in case that's happening? Is that, or did you just describe?
Yeah, I think for those people who trade, I've just described it. You want to think about hedging or buying some protection on your long index trades. If you're long the S&P 500, for example.
Yeah.
Technology stocks are fairly defensible right now. I mean, everybody's crazy about technology. That's going to end at some point as well. And we might see a slight correction in that as well. But I'm still super bullish on the technology sector. It's hard to argue with increasing advertising revenue from Facebook and other companies like Twitter and whatever else. And those are just riding high on a wave of enthusiasm for those types of financial instruments still. But the indexes, the S&P 500, those types of things seem to be, I mean, even the technology sector could be the same. But you want to buy some protection if you can. If you're a currency trader, you want to be short pound Swiss now. That might last a day, it might last a week, it might last 2 weeks. But I think you want to be long the Swiss franc in general. The Swiss franc, Jason, is this type of financial instrument which is viewed as a flight to safety, which means Swiss banks are viewed as neutral and protective, and the Swiss economy is viewed as robust, and that it can survive the impact of financial disruptions. The economy is stable there. The interest rates are stable there. And so when things go wrong in the financial markets, there is a rush to sell riskier assets in London and New York and elsewhere, and then buy things as banal as Swiss bonds or put the money in a Swiss bank. And I know that sounds crazy to you and I because that's not accessible to you and I.
Right.
But to a sovereign wealth fund or to a larger hedge fund, that's definitely a trade that's able to be put on within a matter of minutes. The Japanese yen is similar for investors in Asia in particular. When things kind of go wrong, there's a flight to invest in, just put your money back in cash and in the Japanese yen, which despite the fact that the Japanese economy has been pretty weak and limping around for 15 years, that currency and that economy is viewed as super stable, that the banking system is protected by a whatever, you know what I'm talking about. It's just viewed as a stable economy. Of course, there's always the U.S. dollar and U.S. bonds, but that's a whole nother story. It doesn't seem to react as well as a flight to safety currency. It just doesn't perform as well as the Swiss franc or the Japanese yen. So that's why when we say the financial markets are in disarray or something might go wrong and there's a flight to safety, we talk about money going into the Japanese yen and the Swiss franc because those are markets that it's easily accessible to a large scale investor to put a lot of money into Swiss assets or a Swiss bank account, or that's oversimplifying it, but it's generally like that, or the Japanese yen or a Japanese bank. You take your money out of the Japanese stock market and you put it back in your Japanese money market account. You're selling stocks and you're buying Japanese yen. And when you're buying Japanese yen, the Japanese yen appreciates. So anything / Japanese yen goes down. Anything valued against the Japanese yen goes down. And I think we're already seeing signs that that's happening. And I could be wrong about that, but I get the feeling that we're pretty close to something like that happening.
Well, Rob, when you said earlier that all of this unrest and this sad news about Ukraine and Gaza, when you said that hasn't really seemed to be affecting it yet, why is it generally? I mean, maybe this is a really complicated answer, but why does that sometimes not affect the markets much?
Yeah. Before I say anything, do you have an opinion about that?
Well, either people think that it's not going to hit the financial sector one way or the other, as one of my theories.
Yeah.
Or maybe people think that it's just going to blow over.
Right.
And be a small deal.
Yeah, Greece is on its third bailout. We used to talk about Greece all the time on the podcast. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about Greece. You're right. Nobody cares. I think that the greed of this is terrible. The greed of the wealthiest sound like a conspiracy theorist. I think the Illuminati don't care about the death of children in Gaza. And you have to strike much closer to their heart. You have to strike at the value of their investments more directly. And the way that you do that is by making the governments of emerging markets where they have investments that are hopefully going to make for them a substantial return, above average returns. If those emerging markets governments become unstable, they pull their money out.
Okay.
And that's what you have to do. You have to strike at the heart of the wealthiest, and they just don't care enough. You could probably have violence in London, and there was a massive protest in London that was not publicized. There was a massive protest in support of the Palestinians in Gaza. It wasn't even put on TV. It wasn't even 20,000 people, 30,000 people. Wow. It wasn't even televised. Nobody cares. People just don't care. It's on the news, but I think that generally speaking, if it's not hitting your home, you probably don't care about it. And even the attacks of September 11, we saw a gigantic increase in wealth following that. It rocked the financial markets for a short period of time, but we got over that pretty quickly. Violence, we tend to rally around, we tend to become more resolved. It's really when we're woken up to the fact that our financial assets, we have been overvaluing those financial assets. When the market wakes up to that, that's when things really go wrong. And we always seem to be in shock, Jason. We always seem to be surprised when we find out that companies without revenue really aren't worth very much. Everyone seems to be very shocked by that. And I always find that really interesting. And one last point about that, and I think if you're looking for your nugget of wisdom, podcast listener, this might be it. A friend of mine, Tim Sykes, who trades penny stocks very successfully and has taught thousands of people to do that. Tim was talking about a stock a couple of weeks ago, and the stock had no revenue, and everybody knew it didn't have any revenue, and it was a complete sham. And at any moment in time, it was going to be trading in that stock was going to be halted. And I forget the name of the stock, but it started with a C. And a lot of people shorted that stock at $2 or $3, and Tim Sykes instead bought it. And a lot of people looked at Tim and said, wow, you are the master of selling stocks that are pump and dumps, scams. Why would you do this? And Tim said, no, none of you understand what I do. And what Tim essentially said was, I take advantage of the stupidity of investors or companies. And he said, when something like this happens and when people are squeezing those shorts and running that stock up, they're doing it in a purely speculative fashion. And he rode that stock for a giant gain. I think one of his fellow traders made $100,000 in just a few days on that move. And he said something to the effect that you don't really understand why these stocks finally drop. They always drop on the same pattern in the same way. And until that pattern emerges, it's not interesting to him to sell. He will trade it in the opposite direction. And it calls to mind this important reminder that you can have a lot of terrible things going on in the world and a bullish stock market. You can have a lot of terrible things going on in a certain country and their currency can still appreciate. You can have a lot of weird, crazy things go on with companies not making any money in America in the technology sector and those stocks still running up because it doesn't really matter. The story that we tell ourselves doesn't really matter. Nobody gives a shit. You can bleep that out. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about your story or your hang up about the market. What the market cares about is a pattern. And the pattern is subtle, and it's so subtle that most people don't recognize it. But when it appears, you feel an inherent sense of panic automatically, and you don't really know why. And then everybody follows everybody out the door. And it's like a ship is sinking, and the only way to get out of the ship is through the portholes, and they're not large enough to fit a lot of people at the same time. And you have mass panic. And you can, if you feel yourself feeling claustrophobic listening to that description, That's exactly what investors do. And until that claustrophobia sets in, you don't really get the massive corrections. And there's almost no way to imagine massive claustrophobia setting in from the events that we've talked about, which is kind of unfortunate. But still the same, we're going to need to see the market probably drop and then go up a significant amount more than what it's already done before we see that correction. And the conspiracy theorists aside, if you have a hang up about why the market shouldn't be doing what it's doing, then you are absolutely focusing on the wrong thing. You need to wait for the pattern. And I don't think anybody can tell you what that pattern is, but we don't see the signs of that yet, Jason. Those signs of people panicking just don't exist yet. You haven't seen. Venture capital is still flying high. Box is still going to go public. There are a lot of signs that there is still a lot of money flowing into the technology sector from venture capital firms, and they are not skittish about it still. Wait till you see those venture capital firms pull back. Wait until you see that. But we haven't even hit the top on that. I don't think it's like maybe 18 to 24 months away still.
Okay.
Anyway. So, Jason, I'm sure we are due for a mailbag episode. And I was wondering if next time we come back on the podcast, we could do a mailbag episode.
Yeah, we've got a lot of good comments, so I think that'd be a good time, Rob.
Awesome. And today we're celebrating the release of the Traders Podcast app for Android devices. If you have a smartphone from Google or Android, we would love for you to download the Traders Podcast app. You can find it in the Google Play Store. If you type in Traders Podcast, no spaces between those two words, you will find the app. It will be the only one that comes up. We don't know why that's the way it comes up, but it does that way. And we'll also link to it in the show notes for today's episode on traderspodcast.com. You can link directly to the Google Play Store and download the app. You can see the latest episodes, videos, and we'll even send you notifications to your phone when new content is available. We will also try to surreptitiously and secretly sell you stuff, but but you will not even know that it's happening.
That's right.
Final question, did you see J.J. Abrams standing in front of the new X-Wing fighter on Star Wars Episode 7?
I did not see that. That sounds like a sight to behold.
Yeah, he's got this YouTube video series. He's raising money for children through UNICEF. And if you donate, you get a chance to win a viewing of Star Wars Episode 7 in your home, or even a chance to visit them on the set and be in the movie as they film. And you get to see little tidbits. So every once in a while they release a video, and there's a video with X-Wing fighter. I'm pretty excited about that movie, I have to say.